Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Wilkerson, and I'm the administrator for gambling for the Gambling Initiative for IDHS Super. And on behalf of Governor Pritzker, Secretary Ho, Director Garcia, Stephanie Frank, Kelly Gage, and myself, I welcome you to the 2022 second annual Illinois Summit on Problem Gambling. And now, before we get started, I would like to thank a few folks. First, let me thank LifeWorks, BCPV 360, and our moderators for all their hard work putting this summit together and creating the experience that you are about to have. And I would also like to thank all of our presenters. As you've seen, we have many national experts in the area of problem gambling, and it's going to be a great couple of days. I especially want to point out Dr. Rugel's session tomorrow, as she's going to be introducing an expert-style screening instrument that we will be adding to our accepted screening list. So please make sure you or someone in your organization jumps on and here's Dr. Rugel's presentation. Finally, I want to thank you, the attendees. We know that you're busy, and we really appreciate that you're taking time out of your schedule to attend such a summit like this. We know it's difficult, but I can promise that it will be rewarding and it will be worth the time that you invest. So thank you all for being here. And with that, let's get to our first session. If you have any questions during this session, though, please use the Q&A box below, and Dan's going to answer those questions at the end, and we will be monitoring those to make sure that he sees those questions. And speaking of our presenter, Dan Trillaro is the VP of Prevention US for Epic Risk Management. He graduated from the College of New Jersey with a major in finance and a concentration in economics, and spent 12 years in the world of investment banking. Despite a successful career, Dan also had been suffering in silence with a gambling disorder since high school. In 2013, and after a series of life events, he went on to receive his master's degree in psychology in order to help educate others around the country on prevention, education, and emerging trends in the world of gambling. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me today. And good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from New Jersey, and I will be in Chicago somewhere around 6:30 this evening, just a little bit after the club between the two sessions today and tomorrow, while I'm en route to Omaha, Nebraska. So traveling through O'Hare to get to Omaha, Nebraska, where we'll be dealing and educating and working with Creighton University and some other colleges in the Midwest over the next week. So I want to thank you for having me. It's a privilege and an honor to be a part of the Illinois conference for the next 2 days, and being a part of a conference that includes Dr. Rugel, Dr. Fong, and so many others. So thank you so much for allowing me to kick off the next 2 days with a talk today that will hopefully frame and kind of position ourselves for learning and understanding addiction, but from a slightly different perspective. When we think about addiction, we typically think of the disease model. But if you take the word disease and you were to break it down, we would get a dis-ease. There is something not at ease within each and every one of us that struggles, right? We have a dis-ease, something not at ease inside. That can lead a person to develop problems with substance use, gambling, shopping, food, etc. So the purpose of this keynote this morning is to challenge our thinking, to challenge us at a deeper level, to say what's going on, what's not at ease within each and every one of us, and what are some principles of a meaningful and sustainable long-term recovery. You heard at the open that I am someone who has lived a life struggling with gambling addiction. February 11th, 2010 was the day of my last bet. It's been over 12 years, and I'm very thankful for that. And it's one day at a time. I remember at a conference I attended years ago, CADCA, down in the DC area, Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America. I remember listening to a doctor who said that once the addiction switches on in the brain, it stays on. It has to be managed on a daily basis. And I live my life, and I know so many others around the country who struggle with gambling disorder or any addiction, have to live one day at a time, one moment at a time. I have the privilege and honor to partner with a radio personality out on the East Coast, Craig Carton, who went to prison for his gambling addiction that led to a life of crime similar to mine. And we partner, and we now have a podcast and a live streaming radio show that's reaching over 40,000 people across the country every Saturday morning and on demand. And it's called Hello, My Name is Craig. And it's a firsthand account where we have guests come on and share their personal story, the personal challenges, how it got really bad, and then what life has looked like in recovery. And what's interesting is the common thread is that there was something not at ease. There was some type of pain or some type of fear that went unresolved, or a pain early on in life that led to this development of certain lifestyle, certain experimentation, a way to escape, a way to get out of a negative mood state. And that's what we're trying to achieve today. Let's take a look at addiction, because oftentimes addiction is the solution to the underlying issue. Addiction's not the problem. But people who say I have a drinking problem, you have no problem drinking at all. That's what Midland in their country song says. People say I've got a drinking problem. I've got no problem drinking at all. They call it a problem. I call it a solution. So we oftentimes find our solution in gambling, our solution in drugs or alcohol. As Dr. Rugel said when she did the video with those 3 gentlemen down in Baltimore, Maryland, who were criminally justice involved, oftentimes gambling was their way out, a way out of poverty, a way towards a different life. It wasn't a problem as they saw it, it was their solution. So let's get into the meat of today by asking the first question. What do we use to cover pain in our life? Feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to put it in the question and answer if you'd like. If we have time, and as time permits later, we will address some of those. What do we use to cover pain in our life? Let's see what we have. Yeah, Angie, you're right. It's food, medication, chocolate. Humor is an interesting one. People laugh at times to cover the pain. Exercise, whatever feels good. I remember watching My Strange Addiction. It's a show I watch every so often, not too often anymore. And I remember one episode, the individual was eating dryer sheets. Another time, a person was eating the rubber nibs off of tires because candy, hard candy, didn't do it. And that's so true. It's whatever makes us feel better in the moment, because there comes a point where we're in a negative mood state, a negative state of sorts. And we don't know where we want to get to. We just know we don't want to stay here any longer, right? I don't want to stay in this negative state. I want to move out of it. So what do? I'll do anything to get me out of that negative mood state. And sometimes that can come as a detriment, especially if we start seeing and looking for the same type of activity time and time again. Watching news, insulting others so that we feel better about ourselves. We can essentially become addicted to anything, and it doesn't happen overnight. It becomes this thing that makes us feel better to alleviate or cover pain. It's the mask that we wear. And then when we start going to that same thing, it becomes a habit. So now the neurons start wiring and firing together, and the neural pathway gets strengthened. And then over time, that habit can start to become the thing we need to do to feel better all the time. And that's how we're starting to move towards addiction. But here's a couple of thoughts and observations that we might run through. From time to time, and some of this is also based on personal experience, lived experience, and that's the beauty of what I love doing for a living, is I get to share my lived experience and my inner thinking, and looking back at some of the journaling that I kept to really say, wow, that's what I was thinking at that moment. If I can keep going fast enough, I can, for a little while at least, outrun the fear and the anxiety of the pain. So I just have to go faster. And as long as I'm always busy and I don't have time to sit and think about the pain, I can kind of keep it compartmentalized and tucked away. Let me just stay busy. What we know is that people in early recovery from any addiction, oftentimes that individual is told, stay busy, right? Don't sit. Don't want to have too much free time on your hands. That can lead to some bad decisions while you're starting to learn your life skills and your coping mechanisms. But there comes a point in time along the recovery journey where we have to also be comfortable with silence. It varies from person to person, whether it's the length of time or how long it takes to get there. But there will come a point in time where we're comfortable with silence. I'm not completely comfortable with silence, but I'm a lot better than I was 12 years ago. So it's a journey. There's not a destination. It's an ongoing travel. What we typically also identify is that in that same token, that silence is the enemy. And early on in recovery, that's somewhat true. We hear consistent accounts of people with too much time, not backfilling with other activities or ways to escape those negative mood states, and silence obviously being one of them, and then they go back. You can fill with endless activity. But the concern is that if we're continually trying to fill with endless activity, are we really addressing the issues, the dis-ease, the thing that's not at ease, or are we continuing to run from it? What ties in with gambling addiction or addiction of any sort? What we typically will say is that there's some number of things not at ease within each and every one of us. Every single one of us, 179 participants and growing, there's something not at ease within each. When we woke up this morning, I can look at this list of 10 items, 3, 6, 7, 10 items, and I can always identify at least 2 or 3 that might be off. On a good day, maybe it's just 1, but typically 2 to 3 where I just feel a little bit uneasy. How many do you have? And how does it impact your day-to-day activity? How does it impact your outlook on the day? What do you do to change it, right? How do we alleviate this pain that we're feeling? So as we talk about what's not at ease, we start understanding a little bit more that if I am in a negative state and there's some element or multiple elements of my life that I'm not content with, and I don't have the right life skills, coping mechanisms, or tools to deal with them, sometimes people aren't taught. Sometimes people never learned them. Sometimes they're not equipped. They don't understand how to use tools. They don't understand how they should be feeling because it's just not something culturally they talked about or at a family level. I know when I was growing up, my father was not one to communicate. German culture, very rigid. If there was an emotional issue, we didn't talk about it. You just keep your head down and you keep moving forward. And so it became very difficult in my journey when I was working in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and I saw the second plane hit the towers. It was difficult for me to talk about that. That day, I lost 14 friends, and I lost 2 more to suicide in the months and the weeks that followed. And when you lose 16 friends and coworkers, it's probably a good idea to talk to someone about that. That's where PTSD and trauma creeps in and takes hold physiologically of your body and mentally and emotionally, but it was never taught how to communicate. And so gambling was the outlet that I chose. Gambling was the thing that I grew up around. It was the thing that I only saw as a positive. It was the thing that allowed me to bond with my father because that's when he spoke the most. And when I saw the most emotion in his response and in his eyes, it was at the horse track in northern New Jersey. And so I automatically saw the big win. Remember, the big win doesn't have to be money. It can be an emotional connection. It can be an experience. It can be that aha moment for a young person to say, wow, gambling brings a family together. Gambling makes me feel good. Gambling is good. And when you don't see the negatives, you tuck that away in your pocket. You carry that with you through life. And when life throws that curveball and I find myself in a negative mood state, I'm going to go back to those things that I learned early on. And for me, gambling was the solution, not the problem. But the solution to that deeper underlying issue of pain, the fear of my safety and security had been stripped away, the fear of loss. Will I ever be good enough? Will I ever be safe again? Gambling helps me forget about those things. And you can substitute. Drugs helps me forget about those things. Alcohol helps me forget about those things. Food, exercise, whatever it is, insert that item there. Because that's when we start to understand the progression and how it can really start to maneuver through someone's life. So unresolved pain is a central area of focus. And pain, has been historically thought of, C.S. Lewis so poetically put it, pain is the megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It serves a purpose to tell us something is wrong. If I hit my foot into the bed, my foot will hurt. It's in pain. It tells me, don't do that again, or else it will hurt again. And so pain does serve a purpose, but it also might lead one to seek escape, dissociate from others, isolate from others, avoid the issue altogether because it's just too hard to deal with. And so addiction stems from that pain. And the drug of choice becomes the solution for living in what some would say becomes a hijacked brain. Your brain starts to get hijacked over time. It's taken over by these other feelings, chemicals, responses that feel good, that alleviate pain, that remove from a negative mood state. So it makes sense why we continue to go back to those. I remember working in New Jersey with the New Jersey Council on Compulsive Gambling, the state nonprofit similar to Illinois' council. And I was doing a workshop for senior citizens, older adults in 2019, pre-COVID. And we were talking about gambling harm, responsible gambling, what gambling addiction looks like. And this was a group of people who love to play bingo. And when I was presenting and I talked about bingo, all the eyes in the room said, uh-oh, Mary, you better listen. Listen to what he's talking about, Mary. This applies to you. So I knew Mary was the one I had to really hone in on here. And as we're talking, Mary said she loved playing bingo, not just for the money. It wasn't really about the money, but that's how it made her feel. And I said, can you help me understand a little bit more? She had arthritis for over a decade. But when the bingo game started, her hands didn't hurt, her joints. She said, I felt like I was 15 again. And I could get 5 boards, which was the maximum. She says, I've tried to have more, but they won't give me any. She had 5 boards in front of her. And as the numbers and as the letters are called, B7, she's able to move those hands quickly. And she feels great. But within 45 minutes of the game being over, guess what? The pain returns. And she says, that's why I always want to play bingo. It makes me feel better. I don't want to take drugs. I don't want medication. I don't want pity from anybody. I just want to play bingo. And so when it blocks pain, that dopamine is a great pain blocker. It anchors our learning. It anchors our understanding to feel as if gambling is this thing that will block the pains and remove me from that negative mood state. And pain can exist in different shapes. Specific to gambling, we typically will see the scarcity principle of pain. This is from a book. Seth Haynes was the author of a book called Coming Clean. And he was someone who had struggled with addiction in his life. And he kind of put pain in 3 different shapes. Scarcity is the concept of not having enough, never having enough, always wanting more. There's no peace. There's no rest. I've counseled and worked with several, I'm not a counselor, people who seek counsel or advice I will work with in the sense of the 12-step recovery room of Gamblers Anonymous, peer support rather. I will just kind of hear stories of how their spouses just are now hoarding things. They don't want to get rid of anything. They feel as if so much had been stripped away that now they're afraid to let go of anything else. It's that scarcity concept of pain. It's the abuse concept of pain is number 2. Nobody is safe. This can be physical, emotional, verbal. When you have violence or trauma, you're always, that shape of pain takes the shame and abuse. And then loss and grief, when you lose a loved one, the feeling that you've always been alone and always will be alone. You start reflecting on life. When people lose a spouse, that's painful. And now they're by themselves. Perhaps loved ones have moved away. So these different pain can take different shapes and can look different for each person. But how does pain tie in with what we're talking about today? When you have deep pain, unresolved pain, and you couple that with no mechanism to deal with. I don't know. I was never taught. I don't have the skill set. I don't know what to do, but I do know how to escape. And that's drugs, alcohol, gambling, etc. So deep pain plus no mechanism to deal with it can lead to the world of escape. And with internet gambling on the rise, with gambling expansion, with sports betting, PASPA repealed in 2018, and now state by state it can be enforced, legalized, and regulated. More and more people have that bookie, have a sports book operator in their pocket 24 hours a day, have a casino in their area. And this starts to become a bit concerning for some who might develop a problem. But what are some observations? We're on this opening session today, and we want to make a couple of very clear observations. Life will do what life does. There's no promise of perfect living while we're on this planet. We see it every day. And when life does do that, it's going to hurt and bring pain. Pain is a part of life. And pain is something that we have the ability to feel. Most of us obviously do. It's something we have to deal with and grow through. It's something that can build resiliency over time. And we all go through pain points. Pain points can help get us to that next level, helps get us to that level of maturity, to that level of resiliency, to that level of understanding to say, okay, that was hard, that hurt, but let me put in the work to get through it, or let me learn more about X, Y, and Z. Let me talk to another person. Let me grow through this. Pain does not have to be crippling or debilitating. Pain can be an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for new understanding, an opportunity to develop or refine a skill set, an opportunity to now be a light for others who have gone through similar or may go through them in the future. So when we're working with people who are struggling with addiction, I think it's always important that we don't simply ask why the addiction or how the addiction, but we also try to understand what's the pain, why the pain, how the pain. We're hardwired for pleasure buzz from risky events. And this is specific as we start talking about risk taking. It's certain personality traits lend themselves to developing addictions. We understand age of onset matters. We understand not seeing the negatives at an early age matters, but there's also the bio, psycho, social components, the genetic components, physiological responses that when, as a triathlete for now 18 years, even though COVID slowed that down a little bit, I get a buzz and a rush from going downhill on my road bike at 50 miles an hour. To me, that's risk taking. I'm a gambler in recovery, a person with a gambling problem who no longer gambles on a daily basis, weekly basis, or monthly basis. But there's that something about that feeling. It's a buzz, it's a rush. But remember, risk is all relative. What's risky to one person may not be risky to another. But it's that uncertain nature that feels really good. It's that aha moment. It's when you're done doing a task or a chore or outside with rock climbing or cycling or playing golf, whatever it is you do that makes you feel good. And when you get that big adrenaline rush of something, a shot you just hit or something you've accomplished, it says, yes, that feels good. But it's not just about the successes. In life, the near misses also matter. The near misses are what keep us coming back for more. And in gambling, the near miss is the hook that keeps a person going back for more. It's that I was so close, I want to do it again. And it starts activating the brain. And the brain does not only get activated on a win, it gets activated on the anticipation of the next spin or game, as well as the participation. It's a great video out of the British Broadcasting Corporation that shows an individual with a gambling problem inside an MRI scanner. And they show how his brain reacts while he's gambling. And it's fascinating. You can find it on YouTube. I use it in many of my sessions. And what they typically conclude is that it's not just the winning that matters. It's the anticipation and the participation. And when you reinforce activities every 20 seconds, 30 seconds, it's easy to start escaping the world. The action, the buzz, the adrenaline, the dopamine, it all feels good. The chemicals, the brain is lit up. And all of a sudden, it's easy to start going down that pathway. So how do we begin to untangle the web of pain? Well, if we're talking, many of you on today's opening address deal with youth, deal with young people. And this is an area of concern. The work I do with Epic now is centers on collegiate athletics. We have a partnership with the NCAA where we deliver athlete education sessions on gambling harm to every Division I, II, or III college that wants us, fully funded, fully paid for by the NCAA. And when we talk to youth, I'm on college campuses a bit, and quite a bit actually, and before that would be in high schools around the state of New Jersey. I saw some common themes. And there's a lot of pain in today's youth, as we all are aware. And that pain stems from that feeling of not being enough. I'm not enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not fast enough. I'm not blank enough. And a lot of this comes from social media, and it's a concern. It's that nature of comparison versus compassion. And that's what drives pain. When you talk about that underlying pain of I'm not worthy, I'm not enough. One of my good friends and someone I like to cite often is Brene Brown. She does wonderful work in this field of compassion and not being enough and how to overcome. But we also see pain stemming from who am I? Social media pulls us in so many different directions. Our youth today are experiencing pain points because they're not clear or sure of who they are. They don't know who their friends are. And what's kind of ironic is that the very things like smartphones and laptops and tablets, the very things that keep us connected with others is making us more disconnected from our inner self. And that's the catch-22. Besides pain, we have to deal with fear. So we have pain, right, as one driver underlying the dis-ease of addiction, but there's also a lot of fear because a lot of what motivates us is fear-based. There was a study that was done, let's see here, in the Washington Post, source Chapman University survey on American fears. This is done years ago. The number one fear people had is what I'm doing right now. Of course, I'm behind a laptop and you're all sitting in Illinois, so we have quite a distance between us. However, public speaking is the number one fear. I remember I'm 46, so Seinfeld is a huge part of my life growing up. And some of you might remember that Jerry Seinfeld, great comedian, one time was talking about, the number one fear was public speaking. Number two was fear of death. And he said, so that basically means you'd rather be laying in the casket than giving the eulogy at the funeral. So I always remember that one as being somewhat funny. But you can see these different fears that people have, right? What drives fear? Fears expand too. The fear of not having a secure financial retirement when the stock market drops. The fear of when you have children, when they get their driver's license, like mine will on May 3rd in about a month, will they make it home safely? And it's okay to have fear. It's okay to have worry. And what I oftentimes will kind of discuss with people is the concept of we're allowed to have these different kind of emotions and thoughts and feelings. We're blessed with these opportunities to kind of feel a lot of different ways, but it's important to not get lost in the fear. Don't get lost in the worry. And that's where we start to see people describing it as spiraling downhill. I start spiraling. I start thinking about all that can go wrong. I start it's constantly on my mind. I can't get it out of my head. So when we start getting lost in those fears, we get lost in the worry, we're no longer present. Now we're living in the future of the unknown, right? We're maybe rethinking things that happened in the past, but we're not present. And that strips us of today. And so those are some of the dis-eases when we start going down those paths. It's okay to experience it, but don't let it consume you. We tend to fixate on the worst case scenario. But what we typically will say is when fear hits, I think it's important to ask ourselves, what's true right now? Right now, I am sitting in a room on a chair with my feet touching the ground, my toes wiggling, my hands are on my knees. I'm speaking, I can hear myself, I'm present, I'm in this room, I can hear the buzz of a fan overhead. Those are the things that are true right now. Because trauma, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because it's tied into dis-ease, that tends to pull us back into the past because our body does keep the score. And yes, for those of you on here that have read that book, it's a wonderful book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. It's Bessel van der Kolk. Put it in the chat if you've read that book. It's about the physiological response to trauma and stress on our body. Wonderful book. And as we deal with fear, we have to realize that one of the primary responses when someone is dealing with a fear-based emotion is that they go through anger, which is the secondary emotion. So anger kind of insulates the person. It protects them from that deeper vulnerability. I will share with you that during my days after September 11th, when I witnessed what I had witnessed, I went through a lot of emotion. I cried a lot. I remember getting to the point where I couldn't cry anymore. And I remember for a point in my life, I'm a type A person. I go. And I've worked with many of you on this workshop today. And many of you who know me know that I'm always busy and always go. And I love what I do. But for a season of my life, I didn't have a purpose. A very short season. But I remember waking up in the morning not knowing what was next. And that's a scary place to be. I would get angry, and I would use gambling to escape those fears. And when I would lose gambling, I'd get very angry, and I would never take any physical violence out on an individual or anyone like that. It was more self-inflicted It was stress. It was punching a wall. It was hitting a pillow. It was those outlets. But the anger was just protecting me from my deeper vulnerability of these deep fears, the fear of loss, all that had happened, not knowing how to deal with it. And that was really difficult. Gambling was what sent me to prison. My addiction and my love for gambling ultimately led me to embezzling money from not just my employer, but from my clients as a financial planner. And when I was in prison, it's amazing to see the diverse population of people who deal with emotion in so many different ways. Nothing to do with race or color, just how people process things. And one of the best courses I ever took was called Houses of Healing. And if you're in the criminal justice world or corrections environment, if anyone from Gateway's on there, Houses of Healing, I'm not sure if that's one that's ever been used or people have heard about it. It's emotional awareness, probably one of the most critical pieces of information. The best book and the best workshop I ever was a part of was that, because it helped me understand what's going on, those emotions, those triggers, the relationships at an early age that matter, that were destroyed, and how to get them back. And I've seen grown men crying in that room, Bloods, Crips, people coming together. And it was just so powerful that when you strip away that insulation of anger, we're vulnerable. We're human beings. We're all people first. And that we'll touch on more as we move through the day. As we go through the disease, the dis-ease of addiction, we can't help but think about trauma. One of the biggest concerns we are seeing today are adverse childhood experiences. Those collection of experiences a child goes through, both positive and negative, and as you look at them during a person's life, what were they exposed to at an early age? Were there traumatic experiences? Was there PTSD? Was there abuse or neglect? And when you think about those, how many of our young people have experienced trauma that don't talk about it, don't want to talk about it, or don't know how to approach it? When I was at one of the Division III colleges, a young lady came up to me afterwards, was very brave. She was very vocal about her dealings with being a sexual assault victim. And she said she got so tired of just crying all the time. And it was just wonderful for her to come up and talk to me. We had some things in common with her growing up, etc. And she was very open, very nice, and just very approachable. But she said, I have so much trauma that I have to deal with. And she says, it feels like it lives inside my body. And I immediately thought of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, because trauma does live in our body and it has no voice. I remember after September 11th, we relocated buildings about a couple city blocks over from downtown. And I remember we were next to a helicopter landing pad. Every time I heard that helicopter land on the roof of that building, my heart rate would spike, pupils would dilate, mouth would get dry. I'd get very anxious, and I'd feel like I was going to pass out because I was reliving the events of September 11th. That trauma lives in your body. It steals the feeling from being in control. And that's when we deal with people who might have had traumatic experience, it's important that you deal with it the right way. Please, if you're not comfortable dealing with traumatic experiences, find someone who is and partner up with them. Trauma is one of those things that you have to unpack and then repack before the session's done. You have to do it carefully, diligently, and with care. Trauma can lead to the concept of emotional numbness. You just don't feel. You compartmentalize and you put away. It changes people's perceptions. It changes people's imaginations. Trauma can strip imagination. Imagination is such a vital tool that we have. It allows us to envision a brighter tomorrow. It allows us to see so many possibilities. But if you're constantly caught in a state of trauma and going backwards, it's hard to predict and kind of envision a better tomorrow. It's so critical. So as we go through this morning, in the remaining 15 minutes or so before we leave time for some Q&A, as I see a lot of Q&A in chat, what are principles of a meaningful recovery? We've talked about the dis-ease of addiction, and for the next 2 days, you're going to be hearing different topics from financial well-being. We're going to talk about culture. We're going to talk about emerging trends in sports betting. We're going to talk about utilizing the expert. Dr. Rugel will be doing that. She does a wonderful job. So what are some of the principles of a meaningful recovery? Dr. Robert DuPont, the founding president of the Institute for Behavioral Health, once said, "The end goal of treatment is working toward a sustained and meaningful long-term recovery." I underline sustained and meaningful because it's different for each person. And also, let's not lose sight of the phrase working toward. It's a goal. It's not a destination. It's a constant trip we're on. It's working towards this. What's sustainable and meaningful to me may not be so to you, which is why Dr. Mee Lee with ASAM has always said, he's always asked the question, whose treatment plan is it? Is it your treatment plan or is it the client's? Write it in language they understand, write it in their language, review it every 90 days or as needed, even sooner sometimes, add to it, and work with that client, work toward that sustainable and meaningful long-term recovery. What we oftentimes will see is that the negative thoughts keep us trapped. When we're reliving the traumatic experiences, the PTSD, not having having our adverse childhood experiences, having the negative experience outweigh the positive, it keeps us trapped. But when we can start to develop those positive intentions, that helps to start free us from the bonds that keep us tangled. Awareness is not enough. It's amazing how many times I've heard anecdotally, as well as I've felt this myself, I know I need to make a change. Up here, cognitively, I knew I had to do something. Many of us do, but it's the motivation. I know I feel better when I go to the gym. I know it, but I don't want to sometimes. And that's it. I'm putting my heels in the ground. I'm stomping my feet. I'm pounding the table and I'm crossing my arms. I'm not going. But when I do go, guess what? I feel better. And so sometimes just knowing is not enough. You need that motivation. And that's why if we have awareness without equipping somebody for motivation, it's not going to work. That's why we do need to utilize and educate around the use of life skills, coping mechanisms, anger resolution, emotional awareness. These are all critical. Financial literacy specific to gambling. So critical. Our young people are getting exposed to sports betting apps, cryptocurrency, day trading, all different ways of trying to get rich quick or seek action or seek escape. But what's the harm? What's the cost? Time, rapid reinforcement, the near miss, all of these things are at play. It's warfare. Psychological warfare that then leads and can potentially wreak havoc on some number of people, some percentage. We know the percentage of people who struggle with gambling related harms is relatively small, but what I will say, it exists along a continuum, and the more that you expose and open this activity to people without proper safeguards or checks or resources or interventions, the numbers will grow. I'm not against gambling. I'm against gambling for me, for Dan. Dan can't gamble. People on here that want to gamble, do so responsibly. Know the warning signs. Stay educated. If you have a loved one that has a problem, make sure you're aware of the resources. You can't force them to get help, but what you can do is your part. Know the resources specific to your area. So when the time comes and a person says, hey, listen, I think I want to talk to you about something. I've got a little bit of a gambling problem. You can immediately treat them with compassion. You can meet them where they are, and you have the resources available. When we have people in recovery, we're trying to continually work with them, and they're trying to continually shift their feelings, shift their mindset from one of isolation, from one of anger and hate, from one of being absent and blaming other people. We're trying to shift it to a more positive attitude. An attitude of gratitude, an attitude of being mindful, being present, being determined, being respectful, not just for yourself, but for others around you. Forming relationships instead of isolation. Love, compassion. This is the attitude of recovery that we try to achieve. Humility versus pride and ego. I oftentimes think of the times when I was in active addiction and something would go wrong. I was humiliated. But in recovery, that same or something similar can go wrong, and it can be humbling. And the difference between humiliation and being humbled is the size of one's ego. The bigger the ego, edging the God of my understanding out of my life, ego, that leads to bigger humiliations. But if I start working on getting a little bit smaller in my recovery and letting other people in my life and other situations and other belief systems and being open-minded, when something happens, it's humbling. It doesn't have to be humiliating or debilitating. In recovery, it's important that we do talk about sobriety, because gambling addiction has sobriety as well. We don't put a substance in our body, but it's still a process. If you gave me a urine screen, I'm not going to pee dice. Nothing's going to come out. At least I hope I don't. That would be very painful. But what is true sobriety? What is true recovery? Is it dealing with it or escaping and switching addictions? We see that oftentimes. For those of you on here that might be drug or alcohol counselors, I'm hoping your takeaway from today is, I need to screen for gambling addiction amongst the populations that I serve and deal with. Sure, drug and alcohol, we're treating, we're in recovery, but with sports betting expanding, with daily fantasy sports, with cryptocurrency, with day trading, is the person switching? Are they partaking in other activities that could present problems in their life? Is there something still not at ease within their life that they now feel the need to escape, to do something else? We have to properly attach people in recovery. And we have to recognize what forces are trying to disrupt those good, strong, positive attachments. That can be gambling. It could be drug. It could be food. It could be exercise. We have to stay current. We have to stay present. And what are some of the principles of a meaningful recovery? I think instilling hope. Hope is that pilot light that burns within, just kind of warms the rest of the body, gives us a sense of purpose and meaning. Meaningful recovery is person-driven, person-first language. We'll touch on the importance of language, but language matters. We are not what our addiction is. I'm a person first. I was born a person. I'm a human being. I'm a flawed human being, but I'm a human being and I'm a person. Recovery can take many pathways. There's no one right way. We should encourage people to explore whatever pathway works for them and respect differences along the way. It should be holistic. It should treat the whole person. It should offer peer support. It should involve relationships. It should be culturally sensitive. Where need be, it should address trauma appropriately, safely. It should focus on a person's strengths and responsibilities, and should always be out of respect. When I think about relationships, though, specific to that last slide, I can't help but think of a phrase that I've used time and time again, and I can see it in my own life, is the phrase, rules without relationships leads to rebellion. As we talk about the dis-ease of addiction and what's not going on at the deeper level, sometimes relationships are suffering. Sometimes it's a fear of relationships. It could be culture we grew up in. I grew up in a household, as I mentioned before, where my father, being German, was all about the rules, did not have strong relationships. And so rebellion was there. If we yell the rule louder, we might get short-term compliance, but at what cost? You have a 7-year-old who doesn't clean up their room. You yell at them to clean up their room, and they will, because they're 7. What happens when they become 17, 21, 23? How's the relationship? Relationships matter. Relationships, respect, will reduce risk of rebellion. We're made to be connected. We're spending this time today somewhat distanced and apart physically, but we're all connected through one medium of Zoom, thankfully. We've been connected for the last 45, 50 minutes. When we're talking about connection, we also have to talk about the fear of disconnection, which is shame. And one of the biggest concerns, having just come out of Problem Gambling Awareness Month, is that there's so much stigma and shame around gambling addiction. There's this fear of why are you so greedy? Why are you a degenerate gambler? Phrases, language, words. And when shame builds, it leads to isolation. You don't want to talk about it. Shame says, I am bad. But the difference is guilt says I did something bad. But when we have people who have high stigma attached to an activity they're participating in, the shame builds. And the more shame builds, the less we talk about it. And therefore, we don't ever talk about it. We suffer in silence with this pain, with this dis-ease that's underlying than a lot of the outward manifestations. Shame needs secrecy, silence, and struggle. And gambling addiction has all three. So how do we cultivate a recovery culture? As we're moving through a life of recovery, we're dealing with our issues. We're working. We have therapeutic intervention. We have peer support. We're living a life, and the life is not always uphill. It's a jagged cliff at times. It goes back uphill. It's a winding road. On the podcast a couple months ago, Craig and I had a young man who's in recovery from gambling, and it was sports betting. He's 23 years old. He's in recovery, and he said something interesting. He said, "I don't have a gambling problem. I have a life problem." He says, "I didn't know how to deal with life. I used gambling as the way to cope and deal with life. I used alcohol. I used alcohol and gambling. I used nicotine and gambling." And so we can use many things at times to fill those voids. And he says in recovery, he doesn't need to do that anymore. And I essentially echoed the statement, you need to create a new life where the gambling no longer fits in, because that's what a recovery culture is all about. It's creating a life, creating an environment where those things just don't fit in organically anymore. If we try to keep gambling or drugs or alcohol out of our life, and we keep going to the same bar or hanging out with the same friends or going through the same routines and patterns in the morning, and we're still trying to not do those things, our arms are going to get tired from pushing them away. But if we create a new culture, a new framework, a new box, where we take a different path, we change our routine, we get up a little earlier or a little later, we start our day in a different way, all of a sudden I'm creating a new life where it no longer fits in. It's powerful. It changes the entire process. But there are people who don't seek treatments. And there's a lot of reasons why people don't seek treatment. It's attitudinal and availability, accessibility, etc. But a couple of the deeper ones, and this comes from the late, great Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck had used youthgambling.com's resources, and these are the ones that he really would talk about the most. He was my mentor. He passed away 4 years ago, suddenly. And he spent his time at the Maryland Center for Excellence. Jeff got me in the field, and I will forever always be grateful to Jeff. He always would say that when you stop gambling or drugging or using anything, you're changing your identity. And that's a harsh realization for people. It leads to resistance to change. I mean, it's not just changes to the gambler's thoughts or behaviors. It's now their sense of identity they have to abandon. They've had the same sense of identity potentially for decades. They don't know who they are. It goes back to that question earlier. Who am I? If I'm not this person, who am I? Is it too late to redevelop and redefine your identity? For some, the answer might be yes. For others, the answer might be no. And there's a whole bunch that say, I have no clue. Intermittent reward schedules and outcomes are difficult to abandon. Becomes a person's sense of identity. Gambling was fun. What do? I don't know how to have fun without that in my life. It's also the realization, harsh realization, of wasted time, wasted energy, wasted money perhaps, and personal losses, relationships, items, whatever they be, opportunities. How does a person redefine themselves? These are some of the challenges. As we finish today, before we open up to some question and answer and chat as we close out the opening session, so thankful to have had this opportunity to just spend some time with you all today to kick off the day and help us challenge our thinking about the dis-ease of addiction and what's going on at the deeper level. I see some quotes that I think about that I oftentimes will use. Just because I am or I was an addict doesn't make me a bad person. Deep down inside, we're wonderful, loving people. The ones who struggle with that are the loved ones or the family members, because the family member of someone who struggles with addiction at times, if I'm being quite honest, wants to wring their neck, maybe wants to kill them, wants them out of the house. And that is true. They've been hurt too. They have that pain. They have that fear. Remember, when someone has a gambling addiction, they don't oftentimes just take money out of the household or valuable items. They also steal a sense of safety. They steal a sense of security. They steal that tomorrow that may have been promised at one point. It's not a matter of willpower or a lack of moral compass. That's so true, right? There were a number of times where in my early recovery, I would even have friends come to me who are no longer friends to this day. You kind of realize over time who your true friends are. They say, well, why didn't you just stop? When you had won a certain amount of money, why were you so greedy? Why didn't you just stop? They didn't understand the nature of gambling addiction. A DSM just elevated it in 2013. I say just, I mean, it was 9 years ago, but it still feels like yesterday, to being the only non-substance related disorder on par with substance use disorder, giving medical legitimacy to the disorder. It's a disorder of the brain. I'm not putting a physical substance in my body, but boy, does it sure change my thoughts and feelings, behaviors, and emotions. Addiction is not the entirety of me. I am me. That's a powerful sentence. I am me. I am not just my addiction. There's a lot of other stuff to love. Help people find what those things are. Help someone find those positives, whether it's humble, being humble, being determined, being compassionate, being caring, being empathetic, whatever it might be. I wish people saw the time that addicts spent alone, thinking about everything they've done every time they've lied and stole. That's true. And I will say the amount of mental free space that you have when you're in recovery from all that preoccupation. You can't see preoccupation, but boy, do you feel it. And in recovery, you don't have to think about where to go, what to do, how to do it. You get all this free time back. It's like life just starts flowing into your body. So as we go through the rest of today, we think about the strengths to recovery, active recovery group, not just showing up at a meeting, not just logging onto a Zoom and listening and then logging off, but being active, participate, take control of your recovery. Encourage people to do that. Encourage anyone that you might work with that's in recovery from gambling addiction. Encourage them to supplement the one-on-one counseling or the group counseling with peer support. Encourage that, because then what they hear in the peer support, they can come back and talk to you about from one-on-one sessions. Encourage social support, social networks. And again, don't focus on keeping the addiction out. Focus on creating a new life where the addiction no longer fits in. Focus on meaningful relationships, gainful and meaningful employment, and a commitment to change or transformation. I prefer the word transformation. To me, change is more outward surface. Transformation starts within and you transform into a new person. You're not just doing it at the surface level. And always be mindful of language. Using proper language that can help positively impact one's recovery and their journey. Language, when used negatively, can be stigmatizing, as we know. The word degenerate, greedy, lie, thief, cheat, steal. Whilst it might be true, the language, the power of the tongue can cast both life and death. It can cut a person down. It can influence self-identity. And labels and perception, labels are very, very tricky. So as we summarize today, a couple of points before we open it up. Don't think less of yourself. Just think of yourself less. And over time, things start to improve. Rules without relationships leads to rebellion. Elvin Semrad, a professor from Boston University, once said the greatest sources of suffering are the lies we continue to tell ourselves. So be honest with ourselves. It's not easy, it's not pretty, but it's the key to release us from that mental prison. For people trapped in a mental prison, they battle between enjoying the pain of the pleasure while suffering from the pleasure of the pain. And pleasure is joy's assassin. That's the author Seth Haynes I mentioned. I like finishing on that because a lot of what we've talked about today are these short-term pleasures, fleeting moments, things that feel good, things that get us out of that negative mood state temporarily. But when you can instill some really good skills and tools to help a person create a new life where those short-term pleasures that might be ruining their relationships no longer fit in, you can now start to experience true joy. Joy that's deep, meaningful, sustainable, and long-lasting. I want to thank you all for allowing me to spend the morning with you here. We're about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. So Jim, I will ask if we have some chat, some Q&A, anything that you saw that might have jumped out to you.
We do indeed. You've got several questions, obviously, as you would anticipate, but I'm going to have to filter down a few given the time. But lots of good information, lots of good questions that were coming through. Having said that, let me throw one out here. And what are the withdrawal symptoms of a gambler?
Great question. And that's the one we oftentimes say there's similarities to substance use and gambling, but there are differences. And withdrawal is one of them. With substance use, we have to be very careful because we know a person can actually die from withdrawal from certain drugs of choice when it's substance. But for gambling, the withdrawal symptoms will look more like irritability, restlessness, agitation, not comfortable, constantly thinking about it, talking about it. They're edgy, they're moody. And so they're not putting a drug in their system, but they get certain withdrawal elements when, you can't gamble or someone's watching you and you're afraid to gamble. You'll start, being a little bit more deceitful, lying a little bit more, being a little bit, hiding it a little more. But the three classic ones are the first three I mentioned, kind of that anger, that frustration, the temper starts rising a little bit, the mood changes, and they're definitely irritable and restless.
All right. And I'll say this next one is a very interesting question. So I'm going to throw this out here so you can kind of ponder this for a second. So if addiction is a disease, why am I punished for exhibiting the symptoms of my illness?
That is a great question, and one that has been asked for a long time, right? And I think that's why we try to move people towards recognizing the disease model of addiction. We don't punish people for other diseases, but we punish for addiction. And it's a tricky and it's a sensitive subject. And I want to definitely lead with that, because when you talk to the family members and loved ones of people who struggle with addiction, they're not going to buy the fact that the person who had a gambling problem never had a chance, right? That they weren't involved in some element of choice along the way. And that's where you start running into that element of conversation, if you will, hopefully conversation, positive discourse. You're right. There's stigma. The disease model will oftentimes punish people who've had an addiction or a disorder because of the choices that they made. But when we look at how the brain is hijacked, what gambling does to a person's brain and body as they're going through the addiction, it's not about right or wrong or punishing or not punishing. It's about compassion. And what we know is over long periods of time, when we have empathy and compassion towards other people, we're all flawed human beings. We all make mistakes on a daily basis, some bigger than others. So when we kind of have a level set ground that we're flawed to begin with, it might help us understand and have compassion for another individual who's struggling. We have struggles. And that's why I opened the segment today saying we're not promised of perfect life here. Whatever your belief system is, we see struggles and flaws all around us every day. So it's more about compassion will get us further on this conversation than blame and yelling and screaming.
All right.
Jim, one other point I want to raise. The 12-step fellowship of Gam-Anon, or for the loved ones and family members, oftentimes they'll encourage their participants to say, you can always love the person, but you don't love what they did. You don't love their behavior, right? So it's a big distinction of love the person for who they are, but don't tolerate, condone, or love the behavior. That's a critical component, and I think that really separates it nicely.
Yep. Very good. So Dan, let me say thank you for speaking today. One of the things I'll say is, as one of the folks that published in here in the chat or put something out in the chat said it well, they said, wow, that was good, with lots of exclamation points there. And I think that really sums it up nicely. So we had several requests for slides. Let me just say this to the group. And so I just want to say that we're asking each presenter to provide their slides. As long as they're comfortable with that, then we're going to send those slides out to everybody. And for the group, we'll see you all back here in about 10 minutes for the next session. Please close this window, and as you head back to the main page, select the next session that you're interested in and log back into that section, or that session, excuse me, the session of your choice. So thank you all again for attending. Thank you, Dan. Again, wow, that was good, and we really appreciate it. And we will see you all in just a few minutes.
Great. Thank you all. Have a great day.